Hey there, Visualeconomik community. I'm sure most of you have heard countless times that many African countries have hardly any clean drinking water. This is something that practically everyone knows and that has been explained to all of us since we were small children in school. However, in this matter, there is one thing that is not too clear, namely, what needs to be done to solve the water shortage problems on the continent? Where is the key to ending water scarcity in Africa? The truth is that there are many possibilities, and one of them can be found in Israel. As is the case with many African countries, Israel is a semi-desert country. In other words, water resources are not exactly abundant. And no, don't be fooled by the large body of water you see on this map. Although it looks like a lake full of fresh water, it actually contains some of the saltiest water on the planet. So salty that living creatures such as fish and crustaceans cannot live in it, which is why it is known as the Dead Sea. Well, in order to solve this great water shortage, the government of Israel got to work and began to build huge reservoirs to store rainwater. They also created large canals that carry water from the Galilee Sea, and even developed saltwater purification machines, which today serve to supply more than 50% of the entire local water demand. In short, Israel fixed its problems by investing heavily in infrastructure. So why don't African countries do exactly the same? Where is the downside? Well, this type of investment requires very large sums of money, and we are not only talking about the initial investment, but also about the maintenance and the daily work that they require. Even if African companies or governments invested in this type of infrastructure, sooner or later, they would need to recover the money to offset the costs of the service, either through taxes or through water prices, which, as you can imagine, could end up being so high that many families simply could not afford them. Water is simply too expensive. However, couldn't governments subsidize part of the cost to families? Couldn't they guarantee a minimum amount of water to the population? In fact, yes, there was actually one African country that decreed by law that in 2001 that each family was entitled to 6,000 litres of water per month for free without paying a single dollar. That's right. According to the World Health Organization, 6,000 litres is the minimum that families need to meet basic needs such as hygiene, sanitation, and hydration. So in this way, this country was able to guarantee a minimum supply for its citizens, and on top of that, without making them pay a single dollar. A magnificent idea, don't you think? Well, pay attention, because in reality, the free water measure in this country was a complete disaster. It neither succeeded in providing families with more access to drinking water, nor did it help those most in need. But do you want to know why? Do you want to know why free water is not as good a solution as it seemed at first? Do you want to know which country we are talking about? Of course you do. So pay close attention and let's get cracking. Let's see, if I ask you about an African region with very little water, very poor areas such as the Sahara, Somalia, or Burkina Faso will probably come to your mind first. But do you know what? The country we are going to tell you about is actually a relatively rich country, at least by African standards. In fact, it is the third richest country in the whole continent. We are talking about South Africa.
Millions at risk of severe famine due to severe drought in southern Africa.
Despite its relative wealth, South Africa had, and always had, enormous problems with access to clean water, especially in its black communities. I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but for decades, South Africa was a country led by white people from the United Kingdom and the Netherlands who savagely discriminated against the black population. From the 1940s to the 1990s, especially after the colonization ended, black people were segregated into territories from which they could not escape. They were sorted according to ethnicity and color, and on top of that, suffered severe personal and economic restrictions. This is what became known as apartheid. To give you an idea, black people in those years were completely forbidden to enter the big cities, to vote, to set up their own businesses, and even to get paid the same as whites. They were condemned eternally to misery. But the point is that in the early 1990s, apartheid came to an end. A democratic government was established, and the black population began to enjoy the same rights and freedoms as whites. However, that was far from the end of their problems. Despite the end of apartheid, the black population was still much poorer than the white population. They lived in remote areas with unemployment rates exceeding 40%, poor infrastructure, and not surprisingly, a severe shortage of drinking water. In particular, an estimated 12 out of 36 million people living in the country had no clean water available to them. And, you guessed it, most of them were black people. So for this very reason, one of the main priorities of the new democratic government was to guarantee access to water for everyone. What's more, in 1996, the universal right to water was included in the country's very constitution. To achieve this, infrastructure was built, water management was centralized, and efforts were made to ensure that water reached the most disadvantaged areas. However, that was by no means enough. As we have said before, sometimes the water problem in these types of countries is not limited to the lack of infrastructure or access, but it is in the price that families have to pay for the supply. You see, with the end of apartheid, the black population began to move into the cities, and at the same time, the population increased by almost 12 million people by 2001. And as if that wasn't enough, most of the urban centres were in the hinterlands, areas far away from river mouths. So, what does that all mean? Transporting water and supplying an increasingly large and concentrated population was very, very difficult, and therefore, it was very expensive. In other words, although there was water, many poor people could not afford it, and therefore, they were left to their own devices without access to the supply. Take a look at this.
Last year, I visited a newly installed water supply scheme in a typical South African rural village. The project was well run by a village water committee and had improved the lives of 3,000 people. But when I went down to see the borehole on the banks of a dried out riverbank, I found a young woman with a 3-week-old baby on her back, scooping water out of a hole she had dug in the riverbed. She told me she could not afford to use the taps. South Africa's second Minister of Water Affairs, Ronnie Kasrils.
As you can imagine, despite the advances in some infrastructure, the lack of water continued to be a very, very serious problem in South Africa. And the truth is that this began to generate serious social resentment, particularly taking into account that in 1996, water had been guaranteed in the constitution, something which, however, beyond the words, was never actually fulfilled in practice. But in 2001, an important event changed everything. Do you want to know what happened? Well, listen up.
Water and circuses.
If there is one thing that practically all politicians have in common, it is that in most cases, their primary objective is to win votes. And do you know what? In 2001, South Africa faced one of its first municipal elections since the advent of democracy. Visualeconomik viewers, the leaders wanted votes, and they knew that if they could solve the water problem, they could win a few. Well, and so, that's it then. No sooner said than done. Just one day before the elections, the South African government approved the big star measure in this video. From that moment on, South African families could access 6,000 litres, that's around 1,585 gallons of water, completely free of charge. In other words, the first 6,000 litres consumed would be priced at $0. Well, this measure undoubtedly excited many, but believe it or not, it also garnered significant criticism. Take, for example, this one.
There are substantial errors of inclusion in the free basic water program. Of the 32 million people who received free basic water in May 2005, only 17 million were considered poor by the definition of the Department of Provincial and Local Government. Significant numbers of poor people are excluded from receipt of free basic water. Leatt A, Rosa S, and Hall K, 2005.
The free water policy had one very significant design flaw, and that is that it was very difficult to apply it where it was most needed. Many areas far from the big cities had very precarious local corporations, with few administrative resources and poor infrastructure for such basic things as measuring the volume of water received by each family. In other words, applying the free water scheme was, in practice, extremely complicated. Precisely because of this, by 2007, 6 years after the implementation of the measure, about 25% of the population was still unable to access free water. The proportion of the population that, as you can imagine, was the poorest of all. Or, to put it another way, those who benefited most from this measure were the people who lived in the most developed and wealthiest areas, people who were not poor and who did not need free water. However, that was not all. Another element that was criticised was that the water was distributed per household, not per person. In other words, if only one person lived in a house, they received the same volume of free water as those households where families with 4, 5, or 6 children lived. And this was an enormous problem for 2 reasons. The first is that it was obviously pretty unfair. And the second is that, in order to distribute the first 6,000 litres of free water to each family without breaking the system, the government had to increase the price of the remaining litres. Surprise! In other words, if a household consumed up to 6,000 litres of water, there was no problem. It was free. However, if that household exceeded their limit and consumed more than 6,000 litres, the price of the additional litres would have been much more expensive than it had been before. So if a poor family had many children, they were forced to consume water beyond the free limit, and they ended up paying an exorbitant cost for those extra litres consumed. Having said that, I now know what many of you are thinking. Couldn't the government have increased the number of free litres, or perhaps adapted them to the number of people living in each household? Well, the truth is that this was something that seemed very complicated. On the one hand, South Africa had a lot of administrative difficulties. Basically, they did not have the resources to accurately count the number of people living in each household, nor to prevent some dodgy individuals from using the administrative difficulties to cheat and take advantage of the system. But on the other hand, in some regions, water was so scarce that to considerably increase the volume of free water would have increased consumption so much that water would have run out. The prices were necessary precisely for preventing excessive consumption. So, well, let's just say the government did have much choice either. Be that as it may, and beyond a certain injustice in the system, and the fact that many poor poor families did not benefit from the measure, the truth is that there were many others who did. That is, there were poor families who were able to have their water for free, and thanks to it they could drink, take a shower, and wash their clothes and use the toilet, right? What if I told you that, despite the free water, the poorest families did not increase their water consumption? Well, yes, that's exactly what happened. As you can see in this graph, a study that analysed 60,000 households in one of the poorest regions of South Africa for 7 years found that water consumption did not increase at all after the implementation of the measure. Despite having free water, people did not consume more water. That's a bit strange, don't you think? What is the explanation behind all of this? Well, let's take a look.
Service or cash?
You see, Visualeconomik community, there were two main reasons why the free water measure failed to increase water consumption among South African households. The first is that the free water limit, 6,000 litres, was already very close to the usual consumption of families. And secondly, since water became more expensive after that limit, families started to do their best to stay within their quota so that they wouldn't have to spend much more money. In a way, rather than a measure to promote water consumption, it was a measure that served to reduce costs for families. It was equivalent to a direct transfer of money, something that, by the way, would have required less administrative hassle and could have been distributed directly to the poorest families. So, does that mean it would have been better to simply hand out the money? Well, not exactly. Giving water for free was intended to achieve benefits rather than cost savings. For example, if this measure had succeeded in increasing water consumption, it could have increased people's hygiene, reduced disease, and even prevented some families from the risk of dirty drinking water in order to save some money. In other words, additional social problems could have been avoided. However, free water did not achieve any of these objectives, as water consumption did not increase. As given this, one question we can ask is, how else could they have reduced costs and increased water use among the people? According to the authors of this study, if rather than giving a free water of up to 6,000 litres, a progressive pricing system had been designed, that is, a system where the price would rise without abrupt jumps as more water is consumed, then many of the problems that this measure had could have been solved. For example, families with many children would not have to pay outrageous prices when exceeding 6,000 litres, nor would there be as much incentive to not increase consumption beyond the limit, and in addition, households with 1 or 2 people would not waste free water they did not need since they would have to pay from the start. According to the study, if a progressive tariff were established, water consumption would actually increase among households, and household savings would be similar. As a conclusion, it was estimated that with a non-free but progressively pricing system, welfare would increase by the equivalent of 3.5% in income. So you can see that costs are not always bad, and that free is not always a good solution. In any case, at this point, it is now over to all of you. What did you think of the story of free water in South Africa? How would you solve the water problems of these regions? Do you know of any other interesting cases in other countries? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. And also, if you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at Visualpolitik. I hope you enjoyed it. All the best, and I'll see you next time.